All right. Well, thank you guys for all being here. So this is the third part in our series, our workshop series for creating a culture of wellness, how to intentionally and meaningfully support staff well-being. And I'm really glad you guys are here. I mean, I would love to have a huge turnout and have a bunch of administrators here, and that would be the dream, right? To be able to convey this message to a lot of people. And I really value each and every one of you, and think that all of us can make a meaningful difference and make change. So I appreciate you guys attending and just bringing what you bring to this professional development. I learn a lot from you too. So thanks again for being here. So today what we're going to do, we're going to kind of digest and review and talk a little bit of a couple of the concepts that we've already talked about. And then I have a couple little additions just to throw in there for you to think about. And then we're going to spend some time really in group discussion and reflection. And it's kind of nice that we have a small group so that we can all do that together instead of breaking out. But really kind of inventory what's currently going on in your setting. So wherever you are, whatever sphere of influence you have, whatever classroom that you work in, what's currently happening amongst the staff, what's working, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll move on to some action planning. So what are some things that we can do in our roles, in our environments? And then we'll wrap things up. Okay. Before we get started, is there anything, this is our thing for today. So now that I know better, I do better. Does anybody know who? I thought that this was originally a Maya Angelou quote or reference, but then I found out that it's not, and I've had a really hard time tracking down who it is. If I find out, I'll let you know. But
Michelle Obama. That's my guess.
Yeah, it would not surprise me at all. But I really like this notion of just, we all are doing the best we can with the skills that we have, right? Just as our students are. But you guys are curious, you're here, you're wanting to learn more. And I think that that's a wonderful thing. And as we learn more, we do our best to apply it, right? So when we know better, we try to do better as a parent, as a spouse, as a teacher, as a paraprofessional, as an administrator, whatever role we're in. We can always be learning and be curious and apply that new knowledge that we have. So that'll be our theme for today. I just want to ground us as we do in a quote, and I really liked this one. It's from Manoush Shafiq, who is the director of the London School of Economics. It says, in the past, jobs were about just admitting more people. It says, in the past, jobs were about muscles. Now they're about brains, but in the future, they'll be about the heart.
I like that.
Right? I know. Isn't that a really nice quote? And I was like, gosh, that just really speaks to the progression. And I feel very fortunate to be where we are in this process, that we're in this place now where things are shifting more to appreciating the role that relationships play in our lives and the importance of that, and connection. And we still have a long way to go, but it's starting, right, for us to turn our focus to that and realize how tremendously important it is, no matter what field you work in, right? So I thought that was a nice quote just to ground us in this work. So to revisit and kind of digest a little bit of the information that we've already talked about, and I'll throw in a little new stuff. And again, you guys, as always, feel free to interrupt me. Like if you have a comment, a question, don't hesitate to jump in and add. So as we've mentioned, it'd be really nice if there was a model like such as a stress first aid model for educators, right? So since there are these models for other professions that are more like first responders, that really we're now starting to have that appreciation and respect for educators and seeing educators more, especially due to this past year, as first responders as well. Right? So how the importance of creating this kind of system of a staff wellness or a staff first aid and really meaningfully doing that, right? By starting with the permission to feel. So giving ourselves the permission to feel how we're feeling, positive and negative emotions, and then also creating that space and allowing that to be safe enough for others to feel those that way too. right? To feel how they feel and to own that, and for that to be accepted and for that to be okay. It doesn't mean that things are going to fall apart, right? It actually just allows for more open, honest connection, and support. So with that, we showed the mood meter, and this tool that we can use amongst our teams that we work with to be able to check in with each other and check in with ourselves and see where we find ourselves and if that's somewhere that we want to stay or if there's somewhere that we want to move. So say we are kind of in the red or the blue, which is totally fine. Like maybe we just need to feel that way for a while and we don't want somebody to try to change it. We just need to sit with that. Like I have a colleague who called me the other day and she said, like, you know what, I'm just having a really hard day and I'm really pissed off right now and I just need 5 minutes to vent. I'm just gonna vent for 5 minutes and I was like, okay, like go. She's like, I know I'm gonna say a lot of words that I don't really mean, but I'm just gonna say them because I need to get it off my chest. Right. So she was really upset and she said it and maybe it took her 2 minutes. It wasn't even 5 minutes as she got it out in those 2 minutes. And then she shifted. Right. She shifted. She started saying, like, you know what, actually, now that I'm talking about it, like, this is kind of the direction I want to go. This is how I'm really feeling because she got that off her plate and she was allowed to be upset. Right. And allowed to be angry at a situation. So I think if we allow that, it actually moves towards more growth. Right. Because people don't feel so like they're in the wrong that makes them a bad person. It's just that slippery slope that we all need to be aware of where that can lead to, if it's venting and that's all we do. Right. But I think if we can allow space for it, if we're having more of those difficult times, and then also with the idea that that's accepted, and then do we want to stay there or do we want to shift? Right. So we can use this tool to help us with that. Does anybody want to check in while we're here? Feeling. I can't help but like try to pick words when I see this. I feel like I'm feeling kind of optimistic and uneasy at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because we can be in different places at the same time.
We really appreciated this chart and we brought it up at our team meeting, and then we're bringing it now into our smaller school meetings with our staff. And then some of them, they may modify it, but use it with their students too and add visuals to it for students. So this has been really helpful for us. Thank you.
Oh, great. I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you. That's so nice. And that's starting with allowing that permission to feel, right? Just by introducing this to your teams. That's so wonderful. I'm glad it's been such a useful tool. Lauren saying in the comments, I feel fatigued professionally and personally, but I know that will pass. Yeah, right. That emotional roller coaster of knowing that feelings come and go, emotions come and go. And you're not going to feel that way forever. And it's okay to feel that way right now. So thanks for sharing that, Lauren. All right, guys, I want to spend plenty of time on our discussion. So I'm just going to run through this. Oh, wait, no, I didn't skip one. Okay, so this is some more, this is going to be kind of like newer information to share with you. And I pulled this again. This is a lot of the work still that comes from Brene Brown. And she does a podcast. She has two different podcasts, one called Dare to Lead and one called, I'm blanking on the name of it, but I'm going to look it up right now. It's on Spotify, Unlocking Us. And the Dare to Lead podcast is for people who are in leadership roles, which I think you all are in some way, shape, or form. Has wonderful material. They both do. But if you're looking for more of this leadership material, it's a great podcast. And she talks a lot about what we talked about or the first week was the armored leadership versus wholeheartedness. And so this comes from a part that she did a 2-part series on armored versus daring leadership. And these were 3 of the concepts that I pulled from that I thought were just really pertinent to what we do and how maybe things get framed in our environments. And I thought that this first one's on the far left. It says being a knower and being right, which is more of that armored leadership that we feel like makes a good leader. is that you always have the answers, you know, that you're always that person that somebody can go to and you have a solution to the problem, right? That's in sometimes in some of our culture can appreciate that as like, oh, that's what makes a good leader, right? But really that's kind of armoring up versus being a learner and getting it right. So being a knower and being, oh, it's supposed to be knower, sorry, looks like I typed that in wrong. Being a knower and being right versus being a learner and getting it right. So the distinction there being that we're all recognizing that no matter what position we're in, we're always learning, right? We're always changing, we're always evolving. And the more that we stay curious, the more, and really try to get to the bottom of it when we're supporting somebody else, instead of just imposing a solution and trying to fix a certain problem, a lot of times we're fixing the wrong problem because the person comes to us or the student comes to us thinking that that's the problem. But then if we stay curious and we start asking more questions and trying to figure out like, what do they really want? Like, what are they actually trying to accomplish? And we just stay curious with them a little bit longer, then we stand a better chance of actually getting it right in terms of being able to support them, right? So it's just that concept of being open and staying curious. And then the middle one talks about tapping out of hard conversations versus leaning into and skilling up for hard conversations. So I believe we talked about this a little bit, but I think that oftentimes we have social niceties, you know, where we don't want to upset anybody. And we instead shy away from those more difficult conversations instead of having them and then seeing what can come from that, right? And I find that the easiest way to do this is what Dan Siegel would call like name it to tame it. Just before I'm about to have a difficult conversation, I just say it. And it actually helps to reduce my anxiety because I've been in meetings before where maybe something's going a direction and I may have a difference of opinion and I maybe have some concerns. And I could tell that my heart starts to beat a little faster or that I start to feel like hot is when I know that I'm starting to get kind of upset. And so I've been trying to do this more and more often. It's still on my journey with it. Doing it on a more regular basis and really being brave, right? And maybe I'm going to go against the grain, and that's scary, right? Because it's unpredictable what that response is going to be. But trying to take that deep breath and then say something like, hey guys, I have like, I kind of have a difference of opinion here, and this may be a difficult conversation, right? So I know we're all very passionate about what we do. We all come at things from our different perspectives, through our different lens. So this may be a hard conversation, and I think it's a really important one to have, right? So, and then lead into what I have to say, because that just for me takes the edge off if I can just name it, right? So, but it's skilling up. So being brave enough and modeling that, right? And modeling that we can have a different point of view and that's okay. Modeling that we can give feedback and receive feedback. So we can give feedback in very compassionate, caring ways. It doesn't mean that we don't say anything because we're afraid of hurting somebody's feelings. You know, I know that a lot of times I've really appreciated when I've gotten constructive feedback instead of just being told like I'm doing a great job, which is really nice. But a lot of times, like we're always trying to do better, right? We're always trying to know where are those areas that I can improve and how can I do that. So being able to give that feedback in a compassionate, kind way, and then also being open to receiving it. But in order to do that, we need to create these environments where there's trust and support and where it's safe to be vulnerable, right? Because it doesn't mean that in those hard conversations, people don't get upset, right? People may have some of those difficult feelings. People might feel more in the red and the blue, and that's okay, right? We're not trying to avoid difficult feelings. We're creating a space where that's all okay. And it's how we manage ourselves during that. So skilling up for that. So we can be upset and we can be angry. We can be in those red and blue areas, and yet we can all be supportive of one another in that space and using coping skills in order to stay grounded, right? So that we remain that team player and yet we convey what we're trying to share. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I was just going to say that in my role, when I'm supporting staff, a lot of times, uh, being a therapist, they come to you and and are asking for, you know, help or support. And,
Mhm.
a lot of times I just say, I don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
And, and we, can work together. And
Mhm.
I try to be really humble about that because
Yeah.
that's, you know, I said every day is different. We're learning all the time. Sometimes something's going to work and sometimes it's not. And,
Right.
there's just not we have, but with the students we work with, we have to be, I just say, just be open minded and be flexible because
Mhm.
we just don't know what our day is going to be,
Right.
So
Absolutely.
I always try to have that approach so that um, they might feel more comfortable talking about what they're feeling and what's going on and that I'm not going to judge or,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
So
Or do you just be a place for them to process as opposed
exactly, just
to
to
a
talk,
solution?
yeah,
Yeah. And oftentimes that's what we need, right? It's
yeah,
just that space to hear ourselves say something out loud and then we reach a conclusion on our own,
exactly,
right?
yeah,
And it's also a lot of pressure to have all the answers.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know, I mean, that's a tremendous amount of pressure. And instead of just being curious and saying, like you said, like, I don't know, I don't really have all the answer. I don't have the answer to
yeah.
that. Let's think about it.
And I
Let's
would say, like, what do
get
you think? What's, because I learn from our staff all the time, and I think that that collaboration is really nice to have,
yeah,
so
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, MJ. And then the last one here on the far right is fostering a scarcity driven culture. So, meaning a culture in which we never have enough, like whether it's enough stuff, like enough things, or it's, and I very much so relate to this idea. And she speaks about this in her podcast and in her books a lot. In the Daring Greatly book, she goes into a lot of depth about this concept of scarcity driven culture, but that my parents growing up, or my mom especially, like I remember this being modeled for me a lot of like, well, if I just had X, if I just had this, whether it was a tangible thing or if it was a, more support from grandma, more support from somebody else, then my world would be whole, like my world would be a perfect place, right? And living in that place. But when we live in that place, we're not able to experience what we do have to its great and benefit from that, right? We're not able, we feel like we are never enough. There is never enough stuff, there's never enough X, there's never, and I am never enough, right? Just the way I am with the skills I have right now, right? um so we want to be able to model and be committed to this idea that like I am enough, right? And I know this has helped me a lot in terms of being a parent too, of thinking that I'm not always going to be the perfect mom. um and yet I just, and Dan Siegel talks about this too. He's the author of like The Whole Brain Child, and he has a lot of really excellent books, but he talks about how being the good enough parent, right? That none of us are going to be perfect all the time. We can't have that expectation for ourselves, nor can we have it for other people. So reminding ourselves that we are enough and we have enough, and reinforcing that within our teams. And we're always going to strive to do better, right? We're always going to learn from our mistakes, but we don't want to live in this place of always thinking that we just need X in order for things to be better. So just to elaborate on this a little bit in terms of how we can practice this is and model this, is to acknowledge the small successes and accomplishments. Like I know for personally, like in the teams that I support, this is tough sometimes for people to do. A lot of times we're talking about the problems, we're talking about what's going wrong, and trying to find solutions to those problems. And we're not recognizing the little small successes that we have along the way, or even the big successes. I was in a meeting this morning and we were talking about some of the students in a class, and when the teacher was, talking about some pretty serious issues that some of the students are presenting with. And then we kind of flipped the conversation. And then we were talking about, yeah, and these 2 or 3 students are doing amazing, like the best they've ever done. They are getting all their academics done. They're showing up, they're socializing. One student just used to put her head down with her hoodie on all the time, never made eye contact, and she's like socializing. She's just like doing great. She's thriving. And the teacher, it was just kind of hard to see because she was just like, yeah, and then kind of moved on. Like it was really hard for her to celebrate that success, right? Because it was not something that she's really used to doing, and being able to take ownership for like, yes, that is true. That's happened during her time that she's been in my classroom. And I played a role in that, you know? And so it's, we want to model that that's good. We want to acknowledge that, we want to be able to own that and take responsibility for it. Also acknowledging and normalizing fear and uncertainty. Again, we're not going to have all the answers all the time. Sometimes things are unpredictable a lot of the times. Normalizing that's okay to be afraid, right? And we can also be afraid, and we can be brave, and we can show up, right? We don't need to do everything from a place of full confidence. One time my husband told me when I came home, he said, I was talking about a session I'd had with a kid, and I said, gosh, you know, I really, like, looking back on this, I'm just kind of beating myself up. I really should have just taken this a different direction. It was a real missed opportunity. And like, I'm really bummed that I like did not do a great job with that. And he said, and it was like one of the smartest things that's always like stuck with me. He said, you know, the day you come home and you tell me that like I nailed it, I did everything perfect, like all day long, like that's when I would be worried, because you're working with like human beings, you know, like how could you possibly get it right all the time? And then if you know it all, like you're missing something, right? If you think that you know it all the time, then there's probably something you're missing, right? And that's that curiosity piece of like, what else is there, right? And then the last one here is rewarding and respecting boundaries and self-care. So how can we promote that in our teams too, right? Where we're really honoring that, like, this is important. I support you in taking care of yourself. I support you if you're struggling with a student, that like, absolutely, we give each other a little nod of the head, and we swap out, and you go outside and take 5 deep breaths, you know, or get a drink of water, and then you come back in. Right. And that's really rewarded and respected and encouraged, as opposed to being seen as a sign of weakness. Right. So how do we promote that in our classrooms and in the systems that we work with, as well as self-care and boundary setting? You know, after 5 o'clock, like if you don't hear from me, I'm with my kids, you know, and so it doesn't mean that I'm not paying attention to that, you don't matter to me. But that's my time that I dedicate towards my children. I'll check my email again first thing in the morning, right? And honoring that, respecting that, and not seeing that as, oh, they're just not as passionate about what they do, right? They just don't care as much as I do, right? But instead, we want to respect that and honor that and encourage that and model that for others. All right, guys. So now, any thoughts actually on that before I shift gears here?
I kind of feel like a lot of times if you're feeling you need that, and you either ask for it, or even if a teacher suggests, you're in a classroom, they'll suggest it to the paras, you know, why don't you go take a break? It's almost as if you're in trouble or you're being scolded. So there has to be like a whole paradigm shift on how.
Oh, did Charmaine freeze? I think she did. Just to kind of build on what Charmaine's saying, hopefully she'll join us again in a minute, but I completely, oh, there you are, Charmaine. Are you back?
I guess so. Did I go out?
Yeah, you froze for a second there.
It was really good. I don't know if I can remember it now.
Oh, shoot. Oh, no, that was a wonderful contribution. You were saying that, you know, sometimes it's almost like we interpret it as, oh my gosh, am I doing something wrong? You know, or does it look like I need a break? You know, and thinking that that's really a negative thing as opposed to a supportive thing. And how can we make this more of just part of the environment where it's respected, honored, encouraged, right? And we really trust that the other person values that, has those same values, right? I think Charmaine's freezing again. I think that, I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on this. I mean, again, my thoughts always come back to like, just putting it out there, like having honest team discussions about how can we work on this? Like, is this a value that we all hold? And if it is, how can we promote this amongst ourselves in our team, right? Like, how can I show you that what does it look like to receive support, to feel supported, to respect your boundaries? You know, how can I model, how can I show this, right? And how can I model it for you? So having those open, honest conversations about this is an environment that we want to create for ourselves. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? Okay. Sorry, Charmaine. I know your connection was kind of coming in and out.
I'm
So,
going to put it in the chat.
oh yeah, perfect. You can do that too. So moving on, I wanted to spend a good deal of time on this and then on our action planning. So I wanted to take some time for us to all reflect and you guys to really chime in on, think about like what's currently happening. And this may not be something that your team or your teams are intentionally doing necessarily, but it may be something that just organically has happened amongst the different staff that lends itself to a culture of well-being. Right? So or it could be something that is very intentional. So what are those things? And here's just a few questions to kind of prompt you for you to think about. Like, so is there a current staff wellness plan and or practices? So things that are happening that you may not be intentionally doing that's in place. And if so, what's working about that? Right? What could be enhanced or built upon? And if you don't have anything in place, if there's nothing in place in your environment, then I guess, what did I mean by that question now that I'm saying it out loud? What's not working about your environment, right? So if it's really not working, taking a look at that. Is someone leading the charge? Do you have somebody that's really kind of spearheading this? If so, how is that person receiving support? And then what values are currently being represented in your staff wellness plan or in these practices that have, been are in place right now, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So give you guys kind of a minute or so to think about that. And then when you feel ready, feel free to kind of throw some comments in the chat or unmute and just chime in so we can kind of start sharing, because we can all learn from each other, because you guys all might be doing something, again, intentionally or unintentionally, that is creating a really good work environment where staff feel supported and there is this culture of well-being. So Sarah is saying we don't have one, but I think it would be beneficial. Is there anything, Sarah, that you feel like, and I'm not sure exactly, you can tell us like what role where you probably support a lot of different teams, a lot of different educators, or just in your office space, like, is there anything that happens that you feel like helps that maybe isn't intentional necessarily? It's not named as this is our part of staff well-being, but brings kind of that connection and relationship to the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's kind of a feeling that you are allowed to ask questions and be vulnerable, but when you are, that isn't always actually supported.
Yeah.
And so there's an encouragement to do so, but then it turns into like more of I don't know, like a shame. It can be shaming or shameful. And so anyway, so I think that there is definitely some room for growth there.
Sure.
I really would love the boss to participate in something like this. I will probably mention it to her because I think that I think she says a lot of things and she tries to be supportive, but I think that sometimes it doesn't always translate that way in the long run. So.
Right. Totally. Yeah. So it's kind of like wanting to create this environment where people can feel safe being vulnerable, where vulnerability is encouraged, but not necessarily knowing how to receive that vulnerability and respond to that from a place of support rather than shaming.
Yeah.
Definitely. Kind of building that skill set. Yeah. Yeah, great. Thanks, Sarah. And I see Lauren saying, I'm at 5 school sites. I don't believe any have a wellness plan, but one school site has more of a healthy, supportive feel among the staff compared to other sites that don't feel as unified. Is there anything, Lauren, that you feel like that you notice about the school site that it does seem to be more healthy and supportive? Is there anything that they do? Is there anything that you observe that that you think lends itself to being healthy and supportive?
So compared to some other sites, they have had a stable principal. So the same principal for many years, which I think compared to some of my other school sites, that's really helpful, is having this constant leader. The staff seem to just have a really good rapport with her compared to another site where you just feel tension between the principal and the staff. And at the, not the good site, at the healthier feeling school site, I notice a lot of just staff involvement with like taco day, whole group activities like that. And there's just something really, when you walk on, you just kind of like feel that everyone's connected and everyone's unified and everyone's got the same kind of goal of working together.
Yeah, so more like having fun, like just like connecting and having that camaraderie and like
And rapport building. You know, I think it's a lot of that.
Yeah. And then I heard you say that the principal, there just seems to be like a mutual respect. I'm not sure if that's the term you used, but that's what it sounds like you were describing, that there was like a mutual respect between the staff and the principal. So I wonder what's happening there. You know, it sounds like we're not really privy to the day-to-day interactions, but clearly there's been some healthy relationship that's established there with the administrator.
For sure.
That's great. Thanks, Lauren. And Luz said, we have one. Self-care is a part of our program values. Luz, do you mind if you're comfortable just like elaborating on that? Like how do you in amongst your program, like how has that been made a priority? How is that communicated? And then how is that supported?
Well, as a team, we decided that self-care would be part of our values because we feel it's important. And I feel like Elizabeth has really led the charge in that, implementing it and also modeling, whether it's a quick check-in or, a grateful moment or learning about self-care at meetings.
Yeah.
It's something that we feel it's important to be able to give what we receive as well. So she can definitely speak more on it if she wants. But yeah, it definitely has to be intentional, and it also helps us to be reminded weekly to be able to take care of ourselves. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Luz. I like how you're sharing that it's like kind of infused in a lot of your meetings. Like it's brought up a lot of times. It's not just something that we say we want to do and then we check the box. It's actually revisited. Like it sounds like very frequently.
Yes.
So, and modeled.
Yeah, and kind of what we did is when we created our program values and determined that that was one, then as we were creating our program goals for the following year, we wanted to align our goals to our values. So we started looking at, okay, what are some goals that we can have related to self-care? And so we do a lot of different practices and intentionally incorporate self-care into a lot of what we do, but I really like the idea of creating like an actual written plan, because we're trying to do it internally, but then also model the behavior, because we meet with liaisons from all of the districts who serve youth foster care and youth experiencing homelessness. We need a lot of meetings with probation staff and social services, social workers and things like that. So we want to be constantly like modeling the behavior and being really intentional about what we're doing too, so that they can then kind of take some of this with them as well. So I really like the idea of like really thinking through and making a written like full wellness plan for our staff, and then how are we bringing it out to others.
Absolutely. That sounds awesome, Elizabeth. I love that. I love that idea. And what hits me the most is just how intentional you are in doing that, right? That it's from the leadership that you're really just being very intentional in that work. And that's wonderful. It reminds me too of in the ruler curriculum from Dr. Mark Brackett, he has what's called the charter. And it's exactly what you were describing, Elizabeth, is this connection with our values and then goal setting. And I wonder, I'm sure I have some resources that I can share with you on that if it would be helpful. But how we create a charter, you can do it within within a classroom, you can do it within a school campus, you can do it within an organization. But how do we get everyone's perspectives on the table and feelings on the table when we're developing it? And then how do we come up with these goals and then come up with very observable, things that we can commit to and that we can really kind of make sure that we're doing, right, what we've committed to. So he gives a pretty good framework for that. So if you remind me, I'll be happy to shoot you an email about that, or I can just jot it down right here.
And some of the things we do too are like super simple. So like any meeting that we lead, or like somebody from the transitioning services team, any meeting that we lead, we start every meeting with doing a check-in when we're doing our introductions. What's something that you've recently done for self-care? And then we're hearing about these different opportunities. And then before we actually go into the meeting, we do a short little guided meditation that's just like a YouTube guided meditation that we play. And then at the end of every meeting, as we close, we go around and everybody says something that they're grateful for that day. So like that little thing we've heard about it at so many different areas though, where people have said like, oh my gosh, I really appreciate that, because sometimes like that's the only self-care that I do in the week is when I'm in your meeting. And I incorporated some of the self-care things that I've heard about into my own life. So it's been really cool and super simple to implement.
Yeah, that's awesome, but really impactful. So yeah, that's great. Thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing. And Charmaine said for this to come from the top down, admin and coordinators to staff, and then to have regular staff meetings at the classroom level or office staff doing a check-in and show by example, being vulnerable and practicing these values. Yeah, absolutely, Charmaine. I think that would be the ideal, the goal, right? And I appreciate like some of you have sent me messages, and let me know that you're communicating this to other people within your organization, whether that be administrators or just other colleagues, communicating this information. And that's where it starts, right? Is just keeping talking about it, sharing it out, talking about how much you've benefited from it, how you're trying to practice it, and leading by example, right? So appreciate that. And then including some morale building exercises at our sites. Yeah, absolutely. I think that'd be really nice. I think the balance is always striking this balance between creating the space to be vulnerable and like giving the permission to feel, and then also not that slippery slope that we talked about in the first session of like the toxic positivity, right? Like we don't want people to feel like, we're all just need to be, we're going to recognize that there's feelings, but like we're not really going to address the negative feelings. We're just going to try to shift them into positive ones all the time, right? So how are we going to sit with us to discomfort? Is always the challenge. Anybody else have anything to share on this? Something that maybe is working at your site?
Like the fact that, you mentioned intentional, but really building it into their schedule and their culture naturally. We like to take moment. I think people just seek that connection and just want to be heard. And, they sometimes might feel bad. I mean, that, like to talk about something negative because they know everyone's having a hard time, but just having that moment to just have, your teammates to vent to, that's mental health as well. And then having that moment to share some of their bright spots and be able to, get that encouragement from others. Yeah. And oftentimes in special education, I mean, they can kind of be in an island and not be included in this site. I mean, mental health is such a focus right now, but they don't always include our special needs staff and students. And I think they need it just as much, and especially providing that support for the families. I think, a lot of these parents are having to become, mothers and teachers and just so much more. And so reaching out to them and extending all these resources to them, I think is key as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for that contribution. Yeah, I agree. I think it really, like you said, intentionally, like creating the time, making the time for it, right? So really prioritizing it And then like Charmaine said, like validating those feelings. So validating whatever somebody brings to the space, right? And if it is some time that they just need to vent and get it off their chest and really, but that's connecting, right? That's being in relationship with others. So yeah, I think that's a huge piece of being really, a part of being intentional is creating that space and that time that has to be built in. That's part of our values, right? We're not going to build it in if we don't value it. So anything else before we move on? Okay, well, thank you guys. I think that helped to give some ideas about some things we could do. So now we're just going to talk a little bit about action planning. So we're not going to, we don't have a terrible amount of time. So it's not like we can really sketch out a really thorough plan here. This is more just to kind of get you thinking and jotting down some ideas that maybe you want to just add to what maybe is already working, or or something that you're just kind of thinking, how am I going to get this started, right? What's something I could do? So this is just kind of a sequential way to think about this in terms of action planning. So what is this project that you want to accomplish, the staff wellness plan or policy or whatever we want to call it, right? What needs to happen? So what are those tasks? Who's going to do it? When? By when? And then checking in on the status of that. And this doesn't mean that this needs to be something that you have to kind of come up with this full-blown plan around. This can be like one thing, right? That we really break down. So how do we want to maybe run our meetings? We could start there. So what is that project is like team meetings? What are the tasks? What needs to get accomplished during those team meetings, right? How do we want that to look? So using this as kind of a framework. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because I just want to like promote more of that discussion about what's something within your organization, within your classroom, within your teams, what's one thing that you think you can commit to today? So think about so we're already doing some of these things, but like, what's something that I can do, right? Because we can always be thinking about what can others be doing, but what's something I can do that will intentionally and meaningfully support staff or lend itself to staff and your well-being, right? Within the workplace. Go ahead, MJ.
I was just going to say, pre-COVID, I was on site, so I would be checking in with our teams, in the 3 different campuses. We'd have time to have like the conversations about how the day was going and all of that. But now that I'm hearing all of this, I'm thinking, I also have some more personal conversations with teachers, who might be going through other things, who might want to talk about something, and that does happen also, but it could happen more often. I'm thinking that with hearing all of this, that a lot of times the conversations will go straight to the students, so then it becomes all about the students and we forget to talk about how they're doing. So I think it's just a reminder for me that I can do that more often and make it more of a priority, even if I have to write it in my calendar, because we get talking about the students and the cases, and then, sometimes there's not enough time to really hear, how are you doing personally?
Right.
Like, how is everything going? So at least to offer that.
Yeah. And I think when we ask that question, oftentimes we ask that and it's a very, good, is usually the response, right? And then, but really saying like, no, really, like, how are you doing? Right. And then that's kind of giving the permission to like, bring whatever, like, I really genuinely want to know. Right. And that person that therefore feels seen.
Right.
And
heard, I think also too, if you just sit there long enough,
yeah.
and they'll go, well, good. But then, then something comes up. If you just sit and you really are present and you just listen, and sometimes that's just sitting, being quiet for a minute, and then something comes up. That happens for me too. When I'm talking to my therapist, I was like, oh yeah, I'm fine. Well, there was, so it's kind of the way it works, so yeah.
Absolutely. So creating that space and knowing that silence can be uncomfortable, but it can also be a very powerful time to be able to reflect, Yeah, that's great. Thanks, MJ. Any ideas that anybody has that they kind of want to share with the group? Thinking about something that you think that you do have control over, whether it maybe is just modeling something. You know, I know something that I really want to commit to is modeling this hard conversations piece. You know, I think sometimes I can lend myself to like just being a people pleaser and wanting everybody to be happy and to be, and I want to be liked. And sometimes therefore I shy away from hard conversations, right? For the fear that I may offend somebody or that somebody's not going to like me if I do share my perspective, right? And that can stop me from being brave in that moment and leaning into that difficult conversation. And so I think that's something that I want to commit to practicing more, and doing it in a compassionate, respectful way, right?
I am going to start our written like program wellness plan. And through this conversation, like we do a lot about self-care and kind of those check-ins, but I was just thinking, like we don't really incorporate anything like physical activity or even talking about like eating healthy or different things like that. So I'm going to start creating a wellness plan for the program that we as a team can work on together and really make sure we're incorporating kind of all of the different areas of wellness into that.
Nice. That's great, Elizabeth, and really like living it. It sounds like, you know, that's great. Anybody else have any kind of ideas? If you think about it, like, what do you think is something that you personally could commit to doing? I think that's my next slide anyway. Yeah, that was that. What is kind of your takeaway? Like, what is something that throughout these 3 workshops that we've met, what is either something that you feel like you could commit to doing in order to contribute to your well-being in the workplace, or what's something that you feel like you can do that will lend itself to others' well-being? Or what's a takeaway? What's something that really resonated with you that you're going to that you're going to walk away with? Because we know that with something we get, you know, we hear a lot of information and there's no way we can digest and remember all of it, but what's something that's more salient for you?
I think making that time and providing them with that opportunity, and then remembering the silence piece to give them that moment to express themselves. I also like what you said about just being transparent, and the more you model and the more you share your side, I think it would make them more comfortable and kind of take away that stigma of being able to express it's kind of personal, and to be able to do that more in a comfortable way,
Right. Yeah. Or in an uncomfortable way, right? Like I think Dr. Brene Brown always talks about like being awkward, that like it can be really awkward, right? Like if we're not used to talking about our personal life, or we're not used to kind of, it doesn't mean we have to do that, but if we're not used to doing some of these things and we feel more exposed, we feel more vulnerable, it's going to be awkward, right? But just like you said, I think that's a perfect word. That's the word I was looking for earlier is transparent, right? Just being really transparent in that this may be awkward. Just, I know it's awkward for me, you know, starting by trying to model this and like practicing this skill. But it's also being brave, right? It's also trying something different and doing something new and modeling that then for others and creating that space for them to do the same. Charmaine, you said sharing healthy recipes with coworkers and bringing the dishes to share and build on that. My Italian self is like, absolutely, like every food. There's so much goodness in food, right? I'm always thinking about my next meal. So, and
Right.
sharing a meal with people is like a wonderful way to connect, right? And build relationship. So I love that, Charmaine.
Food is a bonding.
Yeah.
And at least I know in my family it was.
Yeah.
So food's always been important,
Mhm.
not just for eating, but for the whole like environment that it creates.
Yeah, the experience, sharing in that
Experience.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Anybody else have any ideas of what you want to commit to, or any takeaways that you have?
Well, Allison, I liked what you said about committing to that difficult conversation, because I share that with you. I have a hard time with that. And as I've gotten older, it is easier, but then of course that awkwardness comes in, like you were mentioning. And that's kind of where I struggle, is with that awkwardness.
Yeah.
Mm.
I,
You know,
I feel like the naming it to tame it and just being transparent about it and saying this, I'm going to be awkward and trying to do this.
Yes.
Is something that's new for me. And it feels awkward for me. So I can understand how you may receive it as awkward, and I'm going to try.
Yeah. Kind of give a, like a preface it before you launch into it.
Yeah. I find that helpful. And if somebody else said that to me, I would probably pause and be like more interested in what they had to say. Like, oh, this is different. Like,
I think it would set me at ease too.
yeah, totally. I think so too. And I'd be curious. Cool. Well, you and me, Charmaine, we'll be practicing that. We can check in and see how we're doing.
Okay. I think it almost gives the other person like permission to relax and hear what you have to say, instead of like you start launching into whatever you're going to say and they don't know and they're like, oh, and they get off, like you said, awkward.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe that would create a more comfortableness.
Yeah.
I'm going to try it.
I think so. And these are all the things that I think, of course, all the self-care stuff is wonderful. And that is part of a staff well-being policy, right? But that's not all it is either. It's like these kind of things of modeling those difficult conversations, of creating that's the space to be vulnerable, right? But vulnerability is being awkward, having difficult conversations. It's all tied in. All right, guys, I know we just have a few more minutes. Anything else that anybody wanted to share?
I also wanted to appreciate that Padlet. It's been really helpful. So thank you for updating that.
Oh, good. Yeah, you're welcome. I need to add this, some of the slides from here. And then I may link some of the podcasts too, if you guys listen to podcasts. So I'll do that as well. If any of you, and this is kind of a slight tangent, but if any of you are interested in like trauma-informed care as well, there's a wonderful podcast, Dr. Brene Brown, Oprah Winfrey, and Dr. Bruce Perry. Dr. Perry wrote the book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, and he's pretty well known in the trauma field. And he and Oprah Winfrey just came out with a book called What Happened to You? And it's all about trauma, and they delve into ACEs. And then Oprah's really using her platform to lift it up. And Brene Brown interviews them on her podcast. And I was like honestly moved to tears yesterday listening to it. It was just really amazing. So I definitely encourage you to take a look at that, but I'll link both her podcasts as well on there. And
the podcast called Trauma.
That was called what's on her podcast, Unlocking Us. On Spotify. And then it was just the most recent episode with Dr. Perry and Oprah. That's wonderful information. The way they explain things is just fantastic, but all of her podcasts on there are so good. And let's see, I think that's all we have. I'll leave you guys with this quote. Thought it would be a great way to wrap things up. It says, to remain indifferent to the challenges we face is indefensible. If the goal is noble, whether or not it is realized within our lifetime is largely irrelevant. What we must do, therefore, is to strive and persevere and never give up. Right? So no matter wins from the Dalai Lama, like wherever we are in this process of creating this culture of well-being amongst staff, amongst, hopefully lending this to our students, wherever we are is okay, right? It's where we are, right? And so what we're trying to do is just always try to move that forward. And I feel fortunate just to be part of that movement. And that's why that podcast was very hopeful for me that I listened to, because even though it talks about a lot of difficult things, I feel really glad to live in this time where we're at least now acknowledging it and starting to understand it, the importance of this. So thank you all for all your work. Thank you for your participation and contribution. and your time. I really appreciate it. Never hesitate to reach out at any point. If you want to shoot me a text message, I'm really good at text. I'm sometimes slower with emails, but appreciate all forms of communication. And again, thank you guys so much for being here. Thanks. I'm going to stop our